All right, welcome to part two. So this slide, we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the women's roles in the Revolutionary War here. So many of the less wealthy women followed the men. So they followed as camp followers, and General Washington was not excited about this. So not only did he not want freed enslaved workers to go ahead and join the troops, but he didn't want women tagging along either. And it became apparent that he really just had to allow it because there was nowhere else for them to go, and he could make use of their services anyway. So women who followed the camp ended up receiving half rations in exchange for various duties they would perform for the troops. So a lot of domestic chores, cooking, washing, nursing, burying the dead, scavenging post-battle areas for clothing or equipment. Wealthier women who didn't necessarily have to follow their husbands, they could survive while they were gone. They tended to run farms in their husband's stead, run businesses, organize supplies for troops, some fundraising and charity work, and then relief for widows and orphans as well. One thing to keep in mind is that British troops at this point were definitely losing favor, especially in New York, where there was already a shortage of food and housing. It created a lot of friction between troops and civilians. So, of course, British were occupying homes. They were taking part-time jobs in the area. New Jersey, held by the Hessians, those mercenaries from the German states, who had no food and had to live off of the land, so that meant that they were stealing from farms, stealing hay, oats, corn, cattle, horses, and not only that, but they would kidnap and rape young women as well. So they were really upsetting people in New Jersey in particular. And so there were these new continental militias forming in New York, forming in New Jersey in response to the poor treatment. And then in Philadelphia as well, Howe ends up capturing the city of Philadelphia in the fall of 77. And he ended up traveling through Maryland and Pennsylvania, stealing crops and livestock along the way, angering more and more people. And so more continental militias would pop up in those areas as well. Okay, so we're in 1777. June 14th is when we have the creation of the U.S. flag. And Congress said the flag of the United States shall be 13 stripes, alternating red and white, with a union of 13 stars representing the 13 colonies on a white and blue field. And so this was announced in September. So created in June, announced in September. And so this is kind of fun if you'll humor me for a minute. If we go back to this painting, which is a representation of the battles of Trenton and Princeton, you can see there that Washington and the troops have that very flag with them. However, this was taking place in December of 1776, and so the flag actually had not been created yet. So the little boo-boo on the part of the artist there. Okay, so there we are, announced in September. And then we have the Battle of Saratoga. And this takes place between September and October of 1777. John Burgoyne is leading this attack of British troops from Canada. And so he's going to go attack the Americans. And he's got like 9,500 British soldiers and like 2,000 women and children as well. And the Continental Militia and the New England Militia were camped a few miles below Saratoga. And they were able to intercept news that the troops were coming to attack them. So Benedict Arnold led an attack of several thousand soldiers on the redcoats that had been scouted. This was a surprise attack. Burgoyne tried to flee, but ended up surrendering at Saratoga on October 17th of 1777. So to be clear, Benedict Arnold was the hero of the Battle of Saratoga, which is interesting because most of us just know him as the traitor, right? So he's not a traitor yet. He won the Battle of Saratoga, and you can see here we have the flag of the United States, which is appropriate because this battle took place shortly after the flag was announced. And this Battle of Saratoga, it says it changed the course of the war. And that's because, you might recall, I said France was waiting to see the United States win a significant battle. This was that battle. So after this Battle of Saratoga was won, France decided to step in and assist the United States formally. So here we go. This is the formal alliance. However, as I have mentioned, France had been secretly providing aid to the United States for quite a while, since May of 1776. And that was from aristocrats and merchants. And in fact, they'd even been getting like 90% of their gunpowder already from France. But this was the official treaty, two treaties actually. December of 1777 is when the news of Saratoga reached France, and then February is when we have the two treaties. So we have the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, and that basically just promoted trade between France and the U.S., so it lowered tariffs, etc. And then we have the Treaty of Alliance, which stated that neither France or the United States would negotiate peace with England separately, so they would be negotiating a peace agreement together. And it also stated that U.S. independence was a condition of any peace agreement that would be forged. And these were negotiated by Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, Arthur Lee, and then shortly thereafter, 16 French warships sail for the United States with 4,000 troops. Spain allies with the United States in 1779, joining France in that. So Britain ends up declaring war on France, of course, and prepares to fight a war not only in the North America colonies, but globally in all the colonies and in Europe. So General Howe ends up being replaced by General Clinton to take over in North America, and he receives orders to get out of Philadelphia and consolidate back in New York City. So at this point, England had had two stations, one in Philadelphia, one in New York City. So they're saying just consolidate everything to New York City. Okay. Winter at Valley Forge, you may have heard about. Valley Forge was 18 miles from Philadelphia. And at this point, they could not move into actual Philadelphia because England was still there. So Washington and about 11,000 troops were in Valley Forge starving. They couldn't get any food because of the weather conditions, and also because there wasn't much food to be given to them. They didn't quite have the funding or the donations to get food, and whenever they did get food, it was like rotten or stale or moldy or whatever. They were also freezing, so they didn't have very many warm clothes. Not a lot of blankets and supplies, so it was a really harsh winter. And then they were also like really upset because the English were at Philadelphia, where they could have been in buildings nice and warm, and they were upset because of the lack of assistance that the United States was giving them. But really, Congress just didn't have the funds to pay the army or even send supplies and food. Civilians didn't send much because they were pretty indifferent at this point. A lot of the wealthier men whose families were supporting the war had left the army. They were no longer interested in this. So there are a lot of poor men left fighting this war. And unfortunately, the people who could give didn't really care a whole lot about poor people. Like, they were used to this sort of thing, so let's not worry about it. Okay, 1778 is when supplies were brought into Valley Forge finally. Did I say spring? I don't know. I feel like I said the wrong thing. Spring of 1778, so after this winter. It brought supplies, and it also brought Baron von Steuben, who was this famed Prussian soldier. He brought a lot of discipline and training to the military, and because of the training and because of the supplies, morale definitely improved by the summer. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about war at sea. So, 16 French warships came over. That was the most immediate form of assistance. But, the United States didn't have much of a navy at all. It was brand new. Great Britain, on the other hand, had the best navy in the world. And so the British were able to really keep a tight blockade on U.S. northern coastline. But instead of having these major naval battles, the U.S. Navy and thousands of privateers harassed British ships independently. There were no coordinated attacks. mostly smaller vessels sneaking in and out of the blockade very quickly, and just picking off British ships when they could. We do have one major naval battle, though, that takes place over off the coast of Yorkshire by England. And the ship is called Bonhomme Richard versus the Serapis, and this is in 1779. This ship was lent to the United States by France and was actually named after Benjamin Franklin's almanac, which was called Poor Richard's Almanac. So they named the ship after that because they loved Benjamin Franklin so much. So the captain of the Bonhomme Richard ended up, his name was John Paul Jones. He becomes very famous. He ends up capturing the Serapis, and because France saw, like, oh, they do have some skilled naval commanders, they end up increasing French naval support so that the U.S. can make better use of that. French involvement meant that Great Britain had to keep some vessels in the Channel, in the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and also in the Indian Ocean to defend their empire against France. So they couldn't just send all their vessels over to North America. So that helped out a little bit for France and the United States. But France initially didn't really coordinate very well with the U.S. ground troops. So not necessarily like coordinating arrivals of ships with the different battles that were taking place, but they did start to improve on that coordination. July of 1780, they supplied the United States with 5,500 more troops, and then October of 1781, of course, the French fleet assists at the Battle of Yorktown, which really ends up winning the war. Gosh, still haven't gotten over this cold. Okay, this will probably be the last slide for part 2. Where the war starts concentrating in the south. England changes its focus because they see all these cash crops in the south, which are profitable. There are more loyalists in the south. So they start sending more people down there. They also send forces to Florida and the Caribbean as well. And they really believed they could win in the south because, especially in the backcountry, again, there were more loyalists. And the rebels, quote rebels, couldn't afford to use their militia against England when they were worried about slave uprisings. So it's theoretically easier to take. So they really thought they just needed to settle and organize in the south and then move their way north, taking territory all along the way. So in November of 1778, Clinton sends troops to Savannah, Georgia, which he easily captures with support from the loyalists there, and thousands of runaway enslaved people, and even some Cherokee. And with that help, ended up recapturing Georgia's state government. And at the end of 1779, Clinton led troops from New York City to the coast of Georgia to meet up with Cornwallis. So there's a greater number of them there. And they end up together fighting the siege of Charleston in South Carolina. And that's in 1780. This is 6 weeks of bombardment. They're sieging Charleston, fighting. Areas of the city are completely torched. And eventually the U.S. surrenders Charleston on May 12th. And when that happens, Clinton takes his troops and he sails back to New York. He leaves some of them behind under Cornwallis's command. And Cornwallis is told to march from South Carolina up to Virginia, subduing the population of the Carolinas along the way. So there are several battles in the South with many U.S. defeats, but even though there are defeats for the United States, the British suffer heavy casualties. Okay, I'm going to pause here, and we'll come back for part 3, which should be the last part of this lecture. See you soon.